In a sprawling mansion cluttered with the past, a maid named Maria discovers a childhood photograph of herself that shouldn't be there. Shock and confusion flood her as the mansion's owner, a grief-stricken millionaire, struggles to grasp the reality of her finding. How did her own picture end up hidden among his most private possessions? What secret connections bind her to this house of shadows? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling mansion as Maria stood at the wrought iron gates, her heart beating a little faster at the sight before her. The three-story Victorian home might have been impressive once, but now it seemed to slouch under the weight of neglect. Overgrown rose bushes reached out like grasping fingers across the once manicured lawn, and dead leaves scattered across the curved driveway. Taking a deep breath, Maria adjusted her practical work bag on her shoulder and made her way up the stone steps. The windows, clouded with dust and cobwebs, stared down at her like tired eyes. She pressed the doorbell, its chime echoing through what she imagined were empty halls. After a moment, the heavy wooden door creaked open. Maria's first impression of James Winchester was of a man who had forgotten how to care about appearances. His expensive shirt was wrinkled, his dark hair unkempt, and shadows lurked under his eyes. Despite this, she could see traces of the handsome man smiling from the society pages she'd researched before accepting this position. "Miss Santos?" His voice was quiet but clear. "Please come in." "Thank you, Mr. Winchester." Maria stepped into the foyer, where crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears above their heads. A layer of dust dulled their sparkle. "Your references were excellent," he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "The house is yours to manage as you see fit. I'll be in my study most days." He paused, as if searching for more words, then simply nodded and turned away, disappearing down a dimly lit hallway. Maria watched him go, her heart aching at the obvious pain in his bearing. Setting down her bag, she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The living room told a story of happier days. Maria carefully lifted each frame as she dusted, studying the photographs within. James and a beautiful woman with auburn hair smiled from various locations: Paris, Rome, a sunny beach. In each photo, their joy seemed to leap from the glass. The most recent photos showed signs of illness, the woman thinner, but still smiling bravely, James's arm protective around her shoulders. As Maria worked through the morning, she began to understand the geography of grief mapped across the house. Certain rooms felt frozen in time, as if waiting for their mistress to return. Others showed signs of James's restless presence: coffee cups on side tables, scattered newspapers, half-empty glasses. By late afternoon, she had restored some order to the main living areas. The windows now allowed proper light inside. The hardwood floors gleamed, and the air smelled of lemon polish instead of dust. She was gathering her cleaning supplies when movement caught her eye. Through the doorway of the formal living room, she saw James seated in a leather armchair by the fireplace. An untouched glass of amber liquid sat on the table beside him. His gaze was fixed on a large portrait above the mantel, his wife, painted in happier times, her auburn hair glowing in captured sunlight. Maria watched silently as James lifted his hand toward the portrait, then let it fall back to his lap. The loneliness in that simple gesture made her throat tight. She stepped back quietly, leaving him to his private moment of remembrance, the evening shadows lengthening across the newly polished floor. The next morning, Maria hesitated at the threshold of James's bedroom. The master suite felt different from the other rooms she'd cleaned. More intimate, more charged with recent memories. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting a dim glow over the king-sized bed and its rumpled sheets. She moved quietly through the space, gathering discarded clothes and straightening items on the dresser. A woman's perfume bottle sat untouched, a fine layer of dust marking the time since it was last used. Next to it, a silver hairbrush still held strands of auburn hair. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she worked around these personal artifacts, each one a testament to a life cut short. Opening the closet to fetch fresh linens, she found herself face to face with a row of elegant dresses. Their colors ranged from deep jewel tones to soft pastels, each one carefully preserved on padded hangers. On the shelf above, hat boxes and shoe collections waited for an owner who would never return. As Maria stripped the bed and replaced the sheets with crisp, clean ones, she noticed more signs of James's struggle. Sleep aids on the nightstand, a worn photo album peeking out from under the bed, a wedding ring that wasn't his, carefully placed in a small dish beside the lamp. While dusting the bedside table, her cloth caught on something, and a delicate melody suddenly filled the room. Maria froze. The music box had opened, releasing the gentle notes of Beethoven's Für Elise into the quiet space. That was Catherine's favorite. Cancer took her away from me. Maria turned to find James standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of pain and something softer, perhaps nostalgia. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Winchester. I didn't mean to—" Maria started to close the box, but James raised his hand. "No, please, let it play." He stepped into the room, drawn to the small silver box. She used to play this on the piano downstairs, every Sunday morning without fail. His voice grew quiet. "I haven't touched the piano since." Maria stood still, watching as James picked up the music box with careful hands. "She was a musician?" she asked softly. "A music teacher." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "That's how we met. I was hopeless at piano, but I kept scheduling lessons just to see her." His thumb traced the pattern on the box lid. "She knew what I was doing, of course. Called me out on it after the 6th lesson." The melody continued its gentle rotation, filling the space between them with its bittersweet notes. James's eyes grew distant, lost in the memory. "I'll give you some privacy, Mr. Winchester," Maria said quietly, gathering her cleaning supplies. As she reached the door, she glanced back. James had sunk onto the edge of the bed, the music box cradled in his hands, its tune spinning out like a thread connecting present to past. Maria worked methodically in James's study, her feather duster gliding over the rich mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound books. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, highlighting dancing dust motes in its golden beams. The room smelled of old paper and wood polish, a comforting scent that reminded her of libraries. As she moved along the shelving, her cloth caught on a partially open drawer. The drawer stuck slightly, then gave way with a gentle tug. Inside, among paper clips and rubber bands, lay a stack of old photographs. The one on top made her heart skip a beat. Maria's hands trembled as she lifted the photo. The image showed a group of children in summer clothes standing in front of a rustic cabin, her eyes fixed on a small girl with dark braids and a gap-toothed smile. Herself, 35 years younger. She remembered that day, the smell of pine trees, the sound of cicadas. The creak of the study door startled her. James entered, his eyes scanning the shelves. "Mr. Winchester," Maria said, her voice unsteady, "I found something I think we should discuss." She held out the photograph. James approached, adjusting his reading glasses. "What have you got there?" "It's a photograph from Camp Riverside," Maria explained, watching his face carefully. "From the summer of 1998. James took the photograph, his eyebrows rising in surprise. He studied it for a long moment, then looked at Maria with new interest. "Please, sit down. I believe there's quite a story here that needs telling." Maria sank into the chair, her mind whirling with questions as James settled into the seat across from her. The photograph lay between them on a small table, that long-ago summer captured in fading colors, waiting to reveal its secrets. James leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes distant as he traced the edges of the photograph with his finger. "Camp Riverside," he said softly. "I spent every summer there from ages 8 to 14. My parents thought it would be good for me to mix with children from different backgrounds." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the study's Persian rug as he continued. "But what made those summers special was Elena. She was the daughter of our housekeeper, Rosa." His voice grew warmer with the memory. "Rosa wasn't just staff to us. She was family. My mother insisted Elena come to camp with me each year." Maria's hands clasped tightly in her lap as she listened, her heart beating faster with each word. The pieces were starting to fit together like a puzzle she'd carried her whole life. "Elena and I were inseparable during those summers," James continued, pointing to 2 children in the photo standing side by side. "That's us there. We'd spend hours exploring the woods, making up adventures." He paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Elena always wore her hair in 2 braids, just like—" His voice trailed off as he looked more closely at the photograph, then at Maria. The realization seemed to dawn on him slowly, like a sunrise. "Rosa," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rosa was my mother, and I'm Maria Elena Santos." James's face paled. The photograph trembled slightly in his hands as he looked from the image to Maria and back again. James set the photograph down carefully, as if it might shatter. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white. "Rosa's daughter," he whispered. "All this time, you've been Rosa's daughter." The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of unspoken connections. Through the study windows, birds called to each other in the garden, oblivious to the emotional weight of the moment unfolding within. "I remember now," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Rosa left suddenly one winter. My mother never told me why. You stopped coming to camp after that." He looked at Maria with new understanding. "You were just a small child then." Maria nodded, wiping away a tear. "Mother never talked much about those days. She passed away 5 years ago, but she always spoke fondly of your family, especially of a kind boy named Jamie, who was like a son to her." James pressed a hand to his mouth, overwhelmed by the connection. The afternoon light caught the moisture in his eyes as he processed this extraordinary twist of fate. Here, in his study, sat his childhood best friend, the little girl from the photograph who had grown up to become his housekeeper. The grandfather clock in the corner of the study ticked steadily, marking the profound silence that had fallen between them. James's fingers traced the edge of his desk, his mind swimming with memories that suddenly felt fresh and vivid. "Maria," he said softly, shaking his head in wonder. "You always had a book with you, even during lunch breaks at camp. I remember how you'd share your sandwich with me, because I always forgot mine." Maria dabbed at her eyes with the sleeve of her blouse. "Yes, I love to read just like my mother. She passed that love on to me." She smiled through her tears. James chuckled, the sound warming the room. "The kitchen staff knew me well. I'd stuff cookies in my pockets for you." His expression softened. "Do you remember the camp counselor you always hid from?" "Mr. Thompson," Maria said suddenly, surprising herself. "The one with the red whistle who always yelled." "You remember him?" James leaned forward, interested. "Bits and pieces. I remember hiding behind Mother whenever he walked past." Maria's hands fidgeted in her lap. "But I also remember someone standing up for me when he got angry about my muddy shoes." James's eyes widened. The rainy day hike? You were so little, barely 5. He closed his eyes, reconstructing the memory. You couldn't keep up with the older kids, so I carried you on my shoulders through the mud. Tears spilled down Maria's cheeks. I remember feeling tall, like I could touch the trees. She paused, her voice trembling. There was this song that Mother used to sing for me when I was scared. You'd pick that up too. Moon River, James said quietly. It was her favorite. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own recollections. The afternoon sun painted warm squares on the study floor, dust motes dancing in the golden light. Your mother taught me how to skip stones on the lake, James continued, his voice thick with emotion. Your mother had this way of making everyone feel special, feel seen. He looked at Maria, really looked at her, and saw Rosa's kindness reflected in her daughter's eyes. Maria smoothed her skirt, gathering her thoughts. I remember the campfire songs and someone teaching me how to roast the perfect marshmallow. She glanced at James. Was that you? He nodded, a gentle smile playing at his lips. Golden brown on all sides, never burnt. Rosa used to say I took it too seriously. The weight of their shared history settled around them like a comfortable blanket. The distance between employer and employee seemed to shrink with each remembered detail, each shared memory bringing them closer to understanding their unexpected connection. James held the photograph carefully, studying the faces of the children they once were. All these years, he murmured, and here you are, Rosa's daughter, in this house again. Maria looked around the study, seeing it with new eyes. Mother always said her happiest memories were made here. She touched the corner of the photograph gently. I never understood why, until now. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room as Maria and James sat with their tea. The delicate china cups clinked softly as Maria's hands trembled slightly, gathering courage for what she needed to share. My father, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't always angry, but when he started drinking, everything changed. She wrapped her hands around her teacup, drawing comfort from its warmth. James leaned forward in his armchair, his expression gentle and encouraging. He became obsessed with the difference between our family and yours, Maria continued. Every time Mother came home happy from work, he'd accuse her of forgetting her place. She paused, taking a shaky breath. He'd throw things, slam doors, and yell until the neighbors could hear. James set his cup down, his face lined with concern. I had no idea. Your mother never let on that anything was wrong. She was good at hiding it, Maria said softly. She'd cover her bruises with makeup and always had a smile ready for work. But at home, her voice trailed off as she struggled to maintain composure. The final night was the worst, she continued after a moment. Father had been drinking heavily. He followed Mother to work, convinced she was... Maria's voice caught. He thought she was stealing from the family. He burst into the kitchen, shouting horrible accusations. James's knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest of his chair. I remember hearing shouting that night, but I was told it was just a minor disagreement. Mother tried to calm him down, but he started throwing plates. Maria's voice grew quieter. When he grabbed a knife from the counter, Mother knew we had to leave. She resigned that very night, packed our bags, and we were gone before sunrise. James stood up and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a leather-bound photo album. He returned to his seat and carefully opened it, revealing photographs of the mansion's staff from years past. There was Rosa, Maria's mother, standing proudly in her uniform, her kind eyes shining. We should have known, James said, his voice heavy with regret. We should have seen the signs, offered help. He touched the photograph gently. Your mother was more than just staff to us. She was family." Maria wiped away a tear as she looked at her mother's smiling face in the photograph. "She never blamed anyone. She used to say that some battles you have to fight alone." James shook his head, his expression pained. No one should have to face that kind of battle alone. If only we'd known. They sat in silence, looking through the old photographs together, each page turning, revealing another moment from their shared past, now colored by the truth of what had been happening behind the scenes. The attic's dusty air danced in the streams of sunlight filtering through the small window as Maria and James carefully sorted through decades of memories stored in weathered cardboard boxes. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath them as they moved from one stack to another. "Look at this." Maria held up a faded envelope, its corners soft with age. "It's addressed to your mother." James gently took the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "This is from your mother," he said softly, unfolding the delicate paper. "It's a thank you note for helping with my 10th birthday party." Maria smiled, remembering fragments of that celebration. "The cake was enormous, wasn't it? All those chocolate layers." "And your mother made it herself," James added, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "She wouldn't let the cook help. Said it was her special gift to me." They continued exploring, finding more treasures with each box they opened. A hand-knitted scarf that Rosa had made for James's mother one Christmas. A collection of birthday cards from the staff, each signed with personal messages that spoke of the warm relationships that once filled the mansion. "Oh my goodness," Maria gasped, pulling out a small worn teddy bear. "Mr. Buttons, I thought he was lost forever." James leaned closer, examining the stuffed animal. "You used to carry him everywhere during that summer camp, even into the lake, if I remember correctly." "Until you rescued him from drowning," Maria laughed, brushing dust off the bear's matted fur. "You jumped right in, shoes and all." Their laughter filled the attic as they continued working, the pile of discovered treasures growing between them. Each item sparked another memory, another story that connected their shared past. James pulled out a stack of photographs bound with a faded ribbon. "These are from the staff Christmas parties," he said, carefully untying the bow. They huddled together, looking through images of happy faces gathered around decorated tables. "Everyone looks so happy," Maria observed, pointing to a photo of her mother standing next to James's parents, all of them wearing paper crowns from Christmas crackers. "They were more than staff," James said quietly, his finger tracing the outline of his mother's face in the photograph. "These gatherings, they were like family reunions." He looked up at Maria, his eyes filled with warmth. "Having you here now, Maria, it brings back so much of that warmth. You're not just helping maintain the house. You're helping restore its spirit. The way you knew my wife's favorite flowers. How you remember my mother's recipes. You're connecting me to all these precious memories I thought I'd lost." Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to James's words. The distance between employer and employee seemed to dissolve as they sat there, surrounded by the physical remnants of their intertwined histories. "This place," James continued, gesturing to the boxes around them, "it's not just a house full of memories anymore. With you here, it's starting to feel like home again." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Maria poured James his usual cup of coffee. The routine had become comfortable over the past weeks, their shared breakfasts a gentle start to each day. James sat at the small kitchen table, absently stirring his coffee while reading the morning paper. "I've been meaning to tell you something," James said, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "I've decided to sell the mansion." Maria's hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. Sell it? Yes, James continued, his voice steady but distant. I'm thinking of moving abroad, maybe somewhere in Europe. Maria pulled out a chair and sat down, her legs suddenly feeling weak. This seems very sudden. James took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes focused on the dark liquid. I've been considering it for a while now. Being here, surrounded by all these memories, sometimes it feels like I'm living in a museum of my past. But what about all the progress we've made? Maria asked, thinking of their time spent sorting through family memories in the attic. The house is starting to feel alive again. James ran his hand through his graying hair. That's part of the problem, Maria. Every corner holds a memory of my wife, my parents, my childhood, even the happy memories we've uncovered recently. They remind me of everything I've lost. Maria watched him carefully, noting the familiar shadow of grief crossing his features. When would this happen? I've already spoken to a real estate agent. They think the property could sell quickly, given its historical value. James's fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup. Maybe within a few months. And you're certain this is what you want? Maria asked, her voice gentle but firm. James looked up, meeting her concerned gaze. I need a fresh start, Maria. Somewhere where I'm not constantly reminded of what's missing. Where I can wake up in the morning without expecting to hear my wife's voice, or walk down a hallway without seeing her in every photograph. Maria nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his words even as her heart sank. What about the staff? The other workers? They'll receive excellent recommendations and generous severance packages, James assured her. Including you, of course. More than generous, given our connection. Maria stood up, needing to move. I understand, she said quietly, though her mind was racing with concerns about her own future, her stability, her son's schooling. I'm sorry, James added, watching her. I know this affects more than just me. Maria walked to the French doors leading to the garden. May I take a moment? James nodded, and Maria stepped outside into the morning air. The garden, which he had worked so hard to restore, was beginning to show signs of new life. Fresh buds were appearing on the rose bushes, and the flower beds they had recently replanted were sprouting with promise. She walked along the gravel path, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm morning. The news settled heavily in her chest. Not just the practical concerns of finding new employment, but the emotional weight of losing this place that had become more than just a job. The mansion had become a bridge between her past and present, a place where old wounds were beginning to heal. As she looked back at the grand old house, Maria felt her heart ache for James. Despite her own uncertain future, she understood his need to escape the shadows of his grief. Sometimes healing meant leaving things behind, even beautiful things, even important things. Sunlight filtered through the dusty attic windows as Maria and James sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, surrounded by open boxes and scattered photographs. The morning air was thick with history and the musty scent of old paper. Look at this one, James said, holding up a sepia-toned photograph of his grandfather standing proudly beside a vintage car. Must have been around 1925. Maria smiled, carefully sorting through a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly as she set them aside, a familiar fatigue creeping into her muscles. James noticed. Are you all right? She nodded, taking a deep breath. Yes, just need a moment. The illness, it still affects me sometimes. What illness? James asked softly, setting down the photograph. Maria smoothed her skirt, her eyes focused on her hands. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition. It started with extreme fatigue, then joint pain. I was working as an office manager then, but the long hours at the computer. She shook her head. Some days I could barely type. James listened intently as she continued. The medical bills piled up. My son Tommy was only 7, and with no support from his father. Her voice trailed off. I had to leave that job. Couldn't keep up with the pace anymore. That must have been terrifying, James said, his voice gentle. It was. There were days I could barely get out of bed, but Tommy needed breakfast, needed to get to school. Maria picked up a dusty photo album, running her fingers along its leather spine. The treatments helped, but they were expensive. That's when I decided to return to domestic work. The flexible hours, the physical movement, it actually helped with my recovery. James watched as she opened the album, her movements careful and deliberate. And now? I'm better. The condition is managed with medication, though some days are harder than others. She smiled faintly. Tommy's been my rock through it all. He's so mature for his age, always trying to help. Children can surprise us with their strength, James said, reaching for another box. They can, but it breaks my heart sometimes, seeing him take on so much responsibility. Maria paused, looking at an old family portrait of James's family. He shouldn't have to worry about his mother's health, or whether we can afford his school supplies. As they continued sorting through the family artifacts, Maria shared more about her journey, the sleepless nights worrying about bills, the pride of maintaining her independence despite the challenges, the small victories of good health days. James listened, occasionally sharing his own experiences of helplessness during his wife's illness. The morning light shifted across the attic floor as they worked, their conversation weaving between past and present, between sorrow and resilience. You know, James said, carefully placing a stack of books back in their box, I've always admired how you manage everything with such grace. But now, knowing what you've overcome. Maria looked up, meeting his gaze. We all have our battles, don't we? Some are just more visible than others. The understanding that passed between them in that moment went deeper than words. They sat there in the dusty attic, surrounded by the physical remnants of the past, each recognizing in the other a familiar kind of strength, the quiet determination to keep moving forward despite life's challenges. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the library windows as Maria worked methodically, organizing books and dusting shelves. Her hand brushed against the ornate wooden desk's corner, and a small click caught her attention. A hidden panel had sprung loose, revealing a compartment she hadn't noticed before. James, she called out, her voice soft but carrying through the quiet room. I think you should see this. James entered from his study, his reading glasses still perched on his nose. What is it? Maria carefully reached into the compartment and pulled out a leather-bound book, its pages slightly yellowed at the edges. I believe it's Sarah's diary. James's breath caught as he recognized his late wife's handwriting on the cover. He sank into the nearest armchair, his hands trembling slightly as Maria handed him the diary. Would you like me to leave? She asked gently. James shook his head. No, please stay. He opened the diary, and a pressed flower fell from between its pages. Lavender, it was her favorite. Together, they began reading Sarah's words. Her elegant handwriting filled page after page with thoughts about her life, her illness, and most of all, her deep love for James. I worry about him, James read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. Not just about how he'll manage without me, but about his heart. James feels everything so deeply, and I fear he'll lock himself away in his grief. Maria sat quietly beside him as he turned the pages, each entry revealing more of Sarah's inner world. There were good days filled with hope and laughter, and darker ones where she struggled with pain and uncertainty. Listen to this entry, James said, his finger tracing the lines. My greatest wish for James is that he finds someone who understands loss, someone who knows how to rebuild from broken pieces. Life is meant to be lived fully, even after great sadness. I hope he remembers that. Tears welled in James's eyes as he read another passage. I've asked God to send him someone special, someone who can help him remember how to smile again, someone who knows that joy and sorrow can exist side by side, making life richer for their contrast. Maria watched as James carefully closed the diary, holding it against his chest. His shoulders shook slightly as he allowed himself to feel the full weight of Sarah's words. The love and foresight in her final gift to him was overwhelming. She was remarkable, Maria said softly. She was, James agreed, wiping his eyes. Even at the end, she was thinking of others, of me. He looked down at the diary, his thumb brushing over its worn cover. She knew me so well, knew I would need permission to be happy again. The library fell quiet, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock. Through the windows, the garden Sarah had once tended cast dappled shadows on the floor. James sat holding the diary, his expression a mixture of deep sorrow and profound gratitude for the woman who had loved him enough to think beyond her own time. The morning sun streamed through the dining room windows as James and Maria sat across from each other at the breakfast table. Steam rose from their coffee cups, and the gentle clink of silverware filled the comfortable silence between them. Sarah's diary lay on the table between them, its presence a reminder of yesterday's emotional discoveries. I keep thinking about what Sarah wrote, James said, stirring his coffee absently, about how joy and sorrow can exist together. I never quite understood that until recently. Maria nodded, spreading jam on her toast. When I was sick, my little boy would bring me dandelions from the garden. Even on my worst days, those little yellow flowers made me smile. It's strange how happiness finds its way through the cracks. How did you do it? James asked. Keep going, I mean. Some days I can barely get out of bed. One small step at a time, Maria replied. Some days just making my bed felt like climbing a mountain. But I had my son depending on me. And slowly, those small steps added up. James set down his coffee cup. Sarah used to say something similar. She'd tell me, James, darling, life moves forward, whether we're ready or not. She was wise, Maria said softly. My mother used to tell me that grief is just love with nowhere to go. It took me a long time to understand what she meant. They fell into a thoughtful silence, the morning light growing stronger around them. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking the peaceful moments. You know, James said, I've been thinking about the mansion, about selling it. He paused, considering his words carefully. But after reading Sarah's diary, I'm not so sure anymore. Maybe there's still life to be found here. Maria looked up from her plate. What changed your mind? Sarah loved this place. She saw it as more than just a house. It was a home where people could heal and grow. He gestured to the room around them. Like now, sharing breakfast and talking about things that matter. It's different, Maria agreed. When I first arrived, this place felt so heavy with sadness. But lately, it feels lighter, James finished for her. Maria nodded, her eyes meeting his. Yes, exactly. James reached across the table, hesitating for a moment before placing his hand gently over Maria's. The gesture was simple, but filled with understanding, an acknowledgement of their shared experiences and the comfort they'd found in each other's company. The morning light continued to fill the room, warming the space around them as they sat in companionable silence, their breakfast forgotten, connected by the simple touch of hands and the understanding that sometimes the best healing comes from sharing our stories with someone who truly listens. The evening settled over the mansion like a soft blanket, casting long shadows through the library windows. Maria stood at the base of the wooden ladder, studying the towering shelves before her. The day's earlier intimacy at breakfast had left her feeling both unsettled and warm inside. "These really need reorganizing," she murmured, more to herself than to James, who sat nearby in his leather armchair with a book. The ladder creaked as Maria climbed, her hands carefully gripping each rung. The smell of old books and polished wood surrounded her as she reached for a dusty volume on the top shelf. The fabric of her uniform pulled slightly as she stretched. Suddenly, the ladder shifted beneath her feet. Maria's heart jumped to her throat as she felt herself tilt sideways. Before she could cry out, strong hands gripped her waist, steadying her. "I've got you," James said, his voice close behind her. Maria's hands clutched the ladder rungs, her breath coming in quick bursts. James's touch was firm but gentle. His hands warmed through the fabric of her dress. The moment stretched between them like honey dripping from a spoon, sweet and impossibly slow. Neither moved. Maria could feel the slight tremor in James's hands, could sense his breath against her back. The physical contact sent a current of awareness through her body that had nothing to do with her near fall. Finally, Maria found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible in the quiet room. James's hands lingered at her waist, a touch that seemed to burn through the layers of her clothing. When he finally stepped back, the absence of his touch left her feeling strangely bereft. Maria descended the ladder carefully, her legs slightly shaky. When her feet touched the floor, she turned to face him. James stood closer than she expected, his expression a mix of concern and something else she couldn't quite name. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Yes, Maria smoothed her dress with trembling hands. "I'm fine." The space between them felt charged with unspoken words. James took a half step forward, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that seemed both frustrated and confused. "Perhaps we should call it a night," he said finally, though his eyes didn't leave her face. Maria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She gathered her cleaning supplies with mechanical movements, hyper-aware of James's presence behind her. At the library door, they paused awkwardly. "Good night, then," Maria said softly. "Good night, Maria," James replied, her name sounding different somehow in his voice. They parted ways in the hallway, Maria toward the staff quarters, James toward his wing of the house. Each step that took them further apart seemed to echo with questions neither was ready to ask. The afternoon sun filtered through the attic's dusty windows as Maria and James sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, surrounded by boxes of memories. Their earlier awkwardness from the library incident had settled into a comfortable quiet as they worked. "Look at this," James said, pulling out a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper had yellowed with age, but the careful binding had preserved them well. Maria leaned closer, her shoulder barely brushing against James's as she helped him sort through the correspondence. Among the weathered envelopes, one stood out, pristine and sealed, as if it had been waiting all these years to be discovered. "It's addressed to my mother," Maria whispered, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the envelope. The elegant handwriting belonged to James's mother. James touched the seal gently. "We should open it. It's clearly been here for years." With careful movements, Maria broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly as she smoothed it out, and they began to read together. "My dearest Rosa, your loyalty to this family has been more than service. It has been friendship in its purest form. As I write this, knowing my health is failing, I want to ensure your future security. I have amended my will to include a provision for you and your dear Maria. A portion of the estate has been set aside in trust to provide for both of you should anything happen. This is my way of thanking you for the years of devotion you've shown not just to me, but to my James as well. Please keep this letter safe and know that you will always have a home here. With deepest affection, Margaret Winchester. Maria's hand shook as she lowered the letter. I don't understand, she said softly. Mother never mentioned this. We struggled so much after leaving. James took the letter, reading it again with furrowed brows. I wasn't aware of this either. Mother never told me about any provision in her will for your family. But why would she keep it secret? Maria asked, her voice thick with emotion. And why didn't my mother ever claim what was meant for her? James shook his head, puzzled. The timing might explain it. You said you left rather suddenly because of your father. Perhaps Mother never had the chance to give her the letter. Maria picked up the envelope again, studying its unblemished surface. All these years, she murmured. It's been sitting here all these years while we... She couldn't finish the sentence, thinking of the hardships her mother had endured. They sat in thoughtful silence, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams around them. The letter between them represented not just a lost opportunity, but a connection between their families that ran deeper than either had realized. James watched Maria's face as she processed this revelation, noting the mix of gratitude and confusion in her expression. His own mind wrestled with questions about his mother's decisions and the secrets she had kept, even from him. The library's warm wooden panels seemed to hold their secrets close as James and Maria settled into the leather armchairs near the window. The discovered letter lay on the small table between them, its presence almost tangible in the quiet room. I keep thinking about all the things Mother never told me, James said, his voice tinged with hurt. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Maria had come to recognize as a sign of his distress. What else didn't I know about her? About this house? Maria watched him carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders. Sometimes parents keep things from us thinking they're protecting us, she said softly. Though I'm struggling to understand my mother's part in this too. But why? James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Why wouldn't Mother tell me about this provision? It was her will, her decision. I would have supported it. Maybe she worried about causing friction in the family, Maria suggested, though her own voice wavered with uncertainty. My mother, she was always so proud, so determined to make it on her own, even when things were difficult after we left. James picked up the letter, reading it again as if searching for clues between the lines. There could be more we don't know. Other letters, other provisions. He glanced around the vast library. This house has held on to its secrets for so long. Maria twisted her hands in her lap, emotion tightening her throat. I keep thinking about all those years my mother worked extra shifts at the diner, about the times we had to choose between heat and food. She blinked back tears. If we'd known about this. We need to find out if this provision still stands, James said firmly. Mother's will must be on file somewhere. I'll contact Harrison, our family lawyer, first thing tomorrow. Do you think after all this time? Maria left the question hanging. If it was properly documented, if it was never revoked? James nodded slowly. Yes, I think we might be able to honor what Mother intended, even if it's years late. They sat in contemplative silence for a moment, both lost in thoughts of what might have been and what could still be. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor.
I want to understand why, Maria said finally. Why my mother never mentioned this, even when things were at their worst. And why your mother kept it secret from you.
James nodded, his expression determined. Then let's find out. Together. There must be records, documents, maybe even more letters. Harrison might have answers too. He handled all of Mother's legal affairs. Where do we start? Maria asked, sitting straighter in her chair. I'll make some calls, James replied, reaching for his phone. Harrison keeps meticulous records. If there's any trace of this provision, he'll know where to find it. Harrison Matthews, the family lawyer, settled into one of the leather chairs in James's home office, his briefcase open on the polished desk before him. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the afternoon light as he reviewed the documents spread across the surface. The situation is complex, Harrison said, looking up at James and Maria, who sat side by side across from him. The original will does indeed contain this provision for Maria's mother. However, the elapsed time presents certain challenges. Maria's hands twisted nervously in her lap. What kind of challenges? Well, Harrison adjusted his glasses. There's a statute of limitations on claiming inheritance in most cases. We'll need to prove there were extenuating circumstances that prevented the claim from being made earlier. James leaned forward. What about the letter we found? Would that help? The letter is certainly valuable evidence, Harrison nodded, picking up the aged envelope. But we'll need more. Bank records showing your mother's financial situation during those years would be helpful, he said, looking at Maria. Also, any correspondence between her and the family that might explain why she never claimed the inheritance. I have some of Mom's old papers in storage, Maria said. I never went through them properly after she passed, but there might be something there. Harrison made notes in his legal pad. That would be excellent. We'll also need to file several petitions with the probate court. There's quite a bit of paperwork involved. Whatever it takes, James said firmly. Mother clearly wanted this to happen, and I want to honor her wishes. The estate has changed significantly since the original will was written, Harrison continued. We'll need to calculate the current value of the intended bequest, accounting for interest and appreciation. It's not a simple mathematical equation. Maria looked uncomfortable. I don't want to cause any trouble. You're not causing trouble, James interrupted gently. This is about making things right. Harrison cleared his throat. I suggest we start by gathering all possible documentation. Letters, photos, financial records, anything that helps establish the relationship between the families and explains why this bequest wasn't claimed earlier. How long might this process take? James asked. Assuming we can gather all the necessary documentation, Harrison replied. And if there are no major legal obstacles, we could be looking at several months to a year. The lawyer began organizing the papers into neat piles. I'll start preparing the initial petitions. In the meantime, both of you should focus on collecting any relevant documents. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case will be. James nodded decisively. I'll have the attic thoroughly searched. There might be more letters or documents we haven't found yet. And I'll go through Mom's storage unit this weekend, Maria added, her voice stronger now. Harrison closed his briefcase with a click. Good. I'll be in touch with a detailed list of what we need. Don't hesitate to call if you find anything that might be relevant. As the meeting concluded, James and Maria exchanged determined looks. The path ahead would be challenging, but they both felt a sense of purpose in pursuing this unexpected mission together. A few days later, James and Maria met with Harrison again. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on a manila envelope he hadn't yet opened. There's something else we discovered during our review of the family documents, he said carefully. James straightened in his chair, sensing the lawyer's unease. Maria instinctively moved closer to him, her shoulder nearly touching his. What is it, Harrison? James asked, his voice tight. The lawyer opened the envelope with careful movements. These papers were filed away in a separate section of your father's personal records. He pulled out several documents, including what appeared to be a birth certificate and legal correspondence. Your father. He had another child, a daughter. The room fell silent. James's face drained of color as he stared at the documents Harrison placed before him. When? James managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. She was born in 1985, during what appears to have been a difficult period in your parents' marriage. Harrison adjusted his glasses. There are regular payment records to the child's mother spanning several years. James picked up the birth certificate with trembling hands. Claire, he read the name aloud. Claire Winchester. His father had given the child his surname. Maria placed a gentle hand on James's arm. Are you okay? I don't. James shook his head, trying to process the information. All these years, I had a sister, and he never... His voice cracked slightly. He never said a word. Harrison cleared his throat softly. The documents show your father maintained financial support throughout Claire's childhood and established a trust fund for her education. She's currently living in Boston. James ran his hands through his hair, his thoughts racing. Did my mother know? Based on the legal correspondence, yes. They seem to have reached an understanding about the situation, though it was never openly discussed. More secrets, James said bitterly. Always more secrets in this family. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the garden, where the late afternoon shadows were lengthening. Maria watched him with concern. After a moment, she asked, Do you want to meet her, James? He turned back to face them, his expression a mix of vulnerability and determination. Yes, he said quietly. I think I need to. She's my sister. My only living family. He looked at Harrison. Can you arrange it? The lawyer nodded. I can reach out through appropriate channels, yes. Would you like me to do that? Please. James returned to his chair, looking drained but resolute. I want to meet her, to understand this part of my father's life. Maybe... He paused, gathering his thoughts. Maybe it will help make sense of everything. Maria squeezed his arm supportively. You don't have to face this alone. James covered her hand with his own, grateful for her presence. I know, he said softly. Thank you. The evening sun cast long shadows through the study windows as James and Maria sat across from each other, cups of tea growing cold between them. James held the newly discovered documents in his hands, his fingers tracing the edges of his half-sister's birth certificate. I keep thinking about all the Christmases, all the family dinners, he said quietly. She was out there somewhere, probably wondering about us too. Maria leaned forward, her eyes gentle. It must have been difficult for her as well, knowing she had a brother, but never being able to reach out. James nodded slowly. I don't want to waste any more time. She deserves to know she has family who wants to know her. He placed the papers on the desk. But what if she doesn't want to meet me? What if she's angry about being kept secret all these years? Those are natural concerns, Maria replied, her voice warm and reassuring. But from what the documents show, your father did try to provide for her. That might mean something to her. James stood up and walked to his father's old desk, running his hand along the polished wood. You're right, and even if she is angry, she has every right to be. I still want to try. Maria smiled encouragingly. Then let's start looking for her. The lawyer mentioned Boston. That's something to work with. They spent the next hour searching online directories and social media platforms. James pulled out his laptop while Maria jotted down possible leads in a notebook. The search revealed several Claire Winchester in the Boston area. Look at this, Maria said, pointing to a professional networking profile. This Claire Winchester works as an art curator at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. She's around the right age." James leaned in closer, studying the small profile picture. "She has Dad's eyes," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm almost certain that's her." Maria placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Would you like me to help you draft a letter?" James nodded, pulling a sheet of paper from his desk drawer. He picked up his pen, then hesitated. "What do I even say? 'Hello, I'm your brother' seems so inadequate." "Speak from your heart," Maria suggested. "Tell her how you found out about her and how much you want to know her. Be honest about your feelings." James began to write, his pen moving slowly across the paper. "Dear Claire," he read aloud, "my name is James Winchester, and I recently learned that I am your brother." He paused, looking up at Maria. "Is this too direct?" "No," she assured him. "Direct and sincere is good. Keep going." He continued writing, occasionally stopping to gather his thoughts or make corrections. Maria remained quietly supportive, offering gentle suggestions when asked, but mostly allowing James to find his own words. As the letter took shape, James's tension seemed to ease. His shoulders relaxed, and his writing became more fluid. The finished letter was honest, warm, and filled with hope for a future connection. "I want her to know she's welcome in my life," he said, carefully folding the letter. "That whatever happened in the past doesn't change the fact that we're family." A few days had passed, and the day of the big meeting had finally arrived. The small cafe buzzed with quiet conversation as James and Maria sat at a corner table, both stealing glances at the entrance. James kept adjusting his coffee cup, moving it slightly to the left, then back to the right. Maria reached over and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "Remember to breathe," she whispered. The bell above the door chimed, and a woman in her early 40s entered. She had their father's height and eyes, just as James had noticed in her profile picture. Sarah paused at the doorway, scanning the room, until her gaze met James's. He stood up, perhaps too quickly, nearly knocking over his coffee. "Sarah?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, approaching the table with measured steps. "James." Her voice carried a slight Boston accent, and her hands fidgeted with the strap of her purse. Maria stood as well, offering a warm smile. "I'm Maria. Would you like some coffee? Tea?" "Coffee would be nice," Sarah replied, settling into the chair across from James. After Maria returned with Sarah's coffee, an awkward silence fell over the table. Sarah took a small sip, then set her cup down carefully. "Your letter was unexpected," she began. "Mom never thought anyone would reach out." "I didn't know," James said quickly. "About you, I mean. Not until recently when we found some documents." Sarah nodded slowly. "Mom worked as a waitress at the country club where your father, our father, was a member." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "She always said he was kind to her, but distant. When she told him about me, he arranged for financial support, but that was it." James listened intently, his hands clasped tightly around his coffee cup. The father Sarah described seemed like a stranger, so different from the man who had taught him to sail and read him bedtime stories. "It wasn't easy," Sarah continued. "Mom worked 2 jobs. We lived in a small apartment above a convenience store, but she made sure I got an education." A hint of pride crept into her voice. "I put myself through college working nights as a security guard at the museum where I now work as a curator." Maria watched as James processed this information, noting how his expression shifted between guilt and admiration. "I wish I had known," James said softly. "Things could have been different." Sarah's smile was gentle, but guarded. "Maybe, but we can't change the past, can we?" Mom always told me not to be bitter. She said life gives us what we need to become who we're meant to be. James leaned forward slightly. Would you tell me more about your mom and your life growing up? For the next hour, Sarah shared stories of her childhood, the small victories and daily struggles, the Christmas mornings when her mother worked double shifts to afford a special gift, the art classes that sparked her passion for museum work. James listened attentively, occasionally sharing his own memories of their father, building a bridge between their two very different worlds. As their coffee cups emptied, Sarah glanced at her watch. I should get going. I have a meeting at the museum this afternoon. Of course, James said, trying to mask his disappointment. But perhaps, would you be interested in meeting again? Maybe next time with our cousin Elizabeth? She'd love to meet you. Sarah hesitated for a moment before nodding. I'd like that. Maybe next weekend. The autumn evening cast long shadows through the dining room windows of James's mansion as the family gathered for their weekly dinner. The table, once a symbol of James's solitude, now bustled with conversation and the gentle clink of silverware. Sarah sat across from James, while Maria moved gracefully between the kitchen and dining room, bringing out steaming dishes of comfort food. This reminds me of the diner where Mom used to work, Sarah said, sampling the pot roast. She'd bring home leftovers on good nights. It wasn't fancy, but it was always made with love. James set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. Dad used to take me to expensive restaurants, but I don't remember them being half as good as this. He glanced at Maria with appreciation. Speaking of Dad, Sarah began, her voice catching slightly, there's something I've wanted to say for a while. She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For years, I carried this anger about how different our lives were. While you had everything, we struggled. Every time Mom got sick, I'd wonder why he couldn't do more. The room grew quiet. Maria paused in her serving, placing a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. I understand, James said softly. Learning about you, it made me question everything I thought I knew about him. The father I knew was different from yours. He'd send birthday cards, Sarah continued, her voice stronger now. Always with a check inside. No personal message, just his signature. Mom would say, that's just how some people show they care. But I wanted more than money. I wanted a father. James reached across the table, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah took it. You know what's strange? James said. Even though I had him physically present, he was emotionally distant, always buried in work, living up to the family name. The man I knew was trapped by his own choices and secrets. Maria brought out dessert, apple pie still warm from the oven, its aroma filling the room with comfort. As she served the slices, Sarah pulled out an old photograph from her purse. This is the only picture I have of him, she said, sliding it across the table. Mom took it at the country club when he didn't know she was watching. He's laughing at something. James studied the image, surprised by his father's unguarded expression. I've never seen him look so free. He passed the photo back carefully. Maybe we both only knew pieces of who he really was. I'm starting to realize, Sarah said, that holding on to the hurt hasn't served any purpose. Mom always said forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing peace over pain. The evening light had faded to dusk, and Maria lit the candles on the table, their warm glow softening the room's shadows. The conversation flowed easier now, as James and Sarah shared more stories, some painful, some funny, all part of their shared heritage. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah stood up, tears glistening in her eyes. Thank you, she said, for making space for me in your life. James stood too, and without hesitation pulled his sister into a hug. Maria joined them, completing the circle of embrace, as years of unspoken hurts began to heal in the warmth of newfound family bonds. The late summer sun cast a golden glow across the mansion's sprawling backyard as James watched the scene before him with quiet amazement. Children darted between lawn games, their laughter carrying across the perfectly manicured grass, while groups of adults gathered around tables laden with colorful dishes and summer treats. Sarah stood by the grill with her teenage son, teaching him the art of perfectly grilled corn, while Maria orchestrated the flow of food and drinks with natural grace. The sight of his sister and Maria working in harmony brought a warm smile to James's face. "Uncle James," Sarah's son called out, waving him over. "Mom says you know the secret to the best barbecue sauce." James made his way across the lawn, noting how naturally the title of uncle had slipped from the boy's lips. "It's actually your grandmother's recipe," he said, pulling a worn recipe card from his pocket. "I found it in one of the old kitchen drawers." Maria appeared with a tray of fresh lemonade, her eyes twinkling. "I've set up the family photo album station under the oak tree," she announced. "People are already sharing stories." Under the shade of the ancient oak, cousins who had never met before pored over old photographs, pointing out familiar features and shared traits. Sarah's daughter discovered she had the same smile as James's father, while distant relatives marveled at how clearly the family resemblance showed through generations. "Look at this one," an elderly aunt exclaimed, holding up a yellowed photograph. "This must have been taken at the summer house. Sarah, you look just like your father did at that age." Instead of the usual tension that accompanied mentions of their father, Sarah beamed with pride. James squeezed her shoulder gently, both of them finding peace in these simple moments of recognition and belonging. Maria had organized a series of family games, three-legged races, egg and spoon competitions, and a scavenger hunt that had everyone, young and old, scrambling across the grounds in teams. The activities broke down any remaining barriers, as victory celebrations and playful defeats brought everyone closer together. As the afternoon progressed, James found himself surrounded by a tapestry of voices and stories. His cousin's children played tag with Sarah's kids, their shrieks of delight mixing with the murmur of adult conversations and the sizzle of the grill. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the lawn where family members now sat in comfortable circles, sharing dessert and stories. James watched as Maria distributed blankets to ward off the evening chill, her thoughtfulness touching every aspect of the gathering. Sarah joined him on the patio steps, both of them taking in the scene before them. "I never imagined having anything like this," she said softly, gesturing to the gathered family. "It feels like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together." James nodded, watching as Maria organized an impromptu sing-along, her voice carrying clear and sweet across the yard. The simple joy of the moment wrapped around him like a warm embrace, filling spaces in his heart he hadn't realized were empty. The evening sun painted the garden in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured paths. James stood by the rose bushes, his heart beating faster than usual as he watched Maria adjusting a few wayward blooms. The peaceful setting seemed to mirror the calm that had gradually settled into his life since she had entered it. "Would you like to take a walk with me?" he asked, his voice gentle, but carrying a slight tremor of anticipation. Maria looked up, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, and nodded with a warm smile. They walked side by side along the winding garden path, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. The sweet scent of jasmine filled the air, mixing with the earthy fragrance of the evening garden. James cleared his throat, gathering his courage. "Maria," he began, slowing his pace. "These past months have been transformative." His voice carried the weight of emotion he'd held back for so long. "When you first arrived, this house was just an empty shell of memories. But you've brought it back to life. You've brought me back to life." Maria turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. James took a deep breath, his hands slightly trembling as he continued. "You've helped me find my sister, reconnect with family I never knew I had. You've shown me that it's possible to honor the past while embracing the future." He gestured to the garden around them. "Even these flowers, I hadn't noticed them blooming in years. But now, through your eyes, I see beauty everywhere again." They stopped near the old stone fountain, its gentle trickle providing a soothing backdrop to James's words. "I never expected to feel this way again," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But you've awakened something in me I thought was lost forever. Your strength, your kindness, your ability to see good in everything. It's changed me completely." James turned to face Maria fully now, taking her hands in his. "I find myself thinking about you constantly. When you're not here, the house feels empty again. When you are here, everything makes sense." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. "I've fallen in love with you, Maria. Deeply, completely in love." He watched as tears welled up in Maria's eyes, catching the last rays of sunlight. "I know this might seem sudden or complicated given our history, but I can't imagine my future without you in it. You've become essential to my happiness, to my very being." Maria's hands tightened around his as tears spilled onto her cheeks. "James," she whispered, her voice full of emotion, "I've been afraid to admit my own feelings, worried they might be inappropriate or unwelcome." She took a shaky breath. "But I love you too. I love the man you've become, the way you've opened your heart to your family, the kindness you show to everyone around you." A few days later, James sat in the library, with the light casting warm patterns across the oak shelves and leather-bound books. James had deliberately chosen this room, knowing how many meaningful moments they had shared here among the quiet wisdom of countless volumes. Maria entered, expecting another ordinary morning of dusting and organizing. Instead, she found James standing by the antique desk, a small velvet box in his trembling hands. The room had been transformed with dozens of white roses in crystal vases, their sweet fragrance filling the air. "Maria," James said softly, his voice carrying across the hushed space, "this library has witnessed so much of our story. It's where we discovered old photographs, where we learned about our shared past, where we found my late wife's diary." He moved closer to her, his eyes bright with emotion. "It seems fitting that it should witness this moment too." Maria's hand flew to her mouth as James lowered himself to one knee. The morning sun caught the ring as he opened the box, a vintage piece with a delicate diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She was a woman who believed in second chances and the power of love to heal, just like you do." He took a deep breath. "Maria, will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, with all my heart." James slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, then stood to embrace her. They held each other tightly, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment and the journey that had brought them here. Later, as they sat together on the library's window seat, they began sharing their thoughts about the wedding. Maria traced the ring on her finger, still getting used to its presence. "I'd like something intimate," she said. "Something that honors both our families and our history." James nodded, holding her hand. "Perhaps we could have it here, in the garden?" where everything changed for us. He gestured toward the windows overlooking the grounds. We could invite Sarah and her family, make it a true celebration of our joint families. And maybe, Maria added, we could incorporate some elements from both our backgrounds. My mother's traditional recipes for the reception, combined with your family's formal dining traditions. They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, their excitement growing with each idea. They envisioned a ceremony that would blend the elegant with the personal, the traditional with the new. As evening approached, James retrieved a bottle of champagne he had kept chilled for this moment. He poured 2 glasses and handed one to Maria. They stood in the library, surrounded by the books and memories that had witnessed their love story. To us, James said softly, raising his glass. To second chances and new beginnings. To family, Maria added, touching her glass to his. Both the one we were born with and the one we choose. The crystal glasses clinked gently, the sound echoing in the quiet room that had become so central to their story. The dining room of the mansion buzzed with excited chatter as Maria and James sat at the head of the long table, surrounded by their closest family members. The polished surface was covered with fabric swatches, flower catalogs, and handwritten lists. Sarah, James's half-sister, leaned forward with interest as Maria unfolded her ideas. I've been thinking, Maria said, her fingers brushing over the leather-bound diary that lay before her. James's late wife left us such beautiful words about love and hope. Maybe we could include some of them in the ceremony? James reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I think that would be perfect. She would have wanted to be part of this somehow. Sarah nodded, wiping away a tear. Which passages were you thinking of using? Maria opened the diary carefully to a marked page. There's this one about how love grows stronger through sharing both joy and sorrow, and another about finding happiness again after loss. They're not just about James and her, they're about love itself. The group moved on to discussing decorations. Maria pulled out a collection of pressed flowers. These are from the garden where James proposed. I thought we could incorporate them into the centerpieces, mixed with fresh roses. And for music, James added, we found some classical pieces that Maria's mother used to hum while working here. We thought it would be meaningful to include those during the ceremony. They worked through the afternoon, selecting elements that held special significance. The color scheme would reflect the mansion's heritage roses, with soft creams and blush pinks. The menu would feature both traditional family recipes and elegant modern dishes. For the ceremony space, Maria explained, pointing to a sketch, we want to use the garden archway where we first started to see each other differently. We'll dress it with climbing roses and ivory ribbons. James watched her with tender eyes as she detailed their plans. The others contributed suggestions, but always respected the intimate vision the couple had created. As evening approached, the family members began to leave, leaving Maria and James alone with their carefully crafted lists. They sat together, reviewing each decision they'd made. I think we've honored everyone and everything that matters to us, Maria said softly, checking off items on their list. James nodded, looking at the diary. It feels right, doesn't it? Bringing together our past and our future this way? Maria smiled, adding a final checkmark to their wedding plan. It does. Everything we chose tells part of our story. They gathered the samples and notes, their choices made, their hearts full with anticipation of the day to come. The pre-wedding dinner filled the mansion's grand dining room with warmth and laughter. Maria's son Tommy stood proudly next to Sarah, James's half-sister, as they welcomed guests into the elegantly decorated space. Mom always said family was the most important thing. Tommy announced as he helped Sarah arrange the place cards at each setting. "And now we have an even bigger one." Sarah smiled warmly at the boy, adjusting a flower arrangement. "That's right, Tommy. And you're doing such a wonderful job helping me tonight." The dining room buzzed with conversation as family members from both sides took their seats. Tommy moved confidently between the tables, pouring water and explaining the menu to guests with a maturity that made Maria's eyes shine with pride. "Everyone," Sarah called, tapping her glass gently. "Before we begin, Tommy and I would like to say a few words." Tommy stepped forward, his voice clear despite his nervousness. "When Mom told me about James, I was worried at first. But he's shown me what it means to be a real father. He helps me with my homework and came to my science fair. He even taught me how to throw a proper curveball." Touched smiles spread across the room as Tommy continued. "And now we have Aunt Sarah, too, who makes the best cookies and always has time to listen to my stories." Sarah wrapped an arm around Tommy's shoulders before speaking. "When I first learned about James being my brother, I didn't know what to expect. But Maria and Tommy helped make everything feel natural and right. They showed me what unconditional acceptance looks like." As the evening progressed, Tommy and Sarah worked as a team, serving dishes and facilitating introductions between different family members. They shared stories about James and Maria, from Tommy's account of teaching James to play video games to Sarah's tale of their first awkward family dinner. The atmosphere grew increasingly relaxed as barriers between the families dissolved. Cousins exchanged phone numbers, aunts shared recipes, and uncles debated sports teams with growing camaraderie. Maria watched from her seat as Tommy excitedly showed James's elderly aunt his latest school project photos on his phone. Nearby, Sarah engaged in animated conversation with Maria's cousin about their shared interest in gardening. "This is better than I could have imagined," James whispered to Maria, watching their families blend so naturally. "Tommy and Sarah really made it happen," Maria replied softly. "They've shown everyone how beautiful these new connections can be." The evening flowed with natural ease, filled with shared laughter and the warmth of newfound family bonds. As dessert was served, the conversation had grown so comfortable that it was hard to tell who had known each other for years and who had just met that evening. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the mansion's bridal suite, casting a warm glow over Maria as she sat at the antique vanity. Her friends bustled around her, adjusting her veil and touching up her makeup, while Sarah carefully arranged white roses in her hair. Tommy knocked on the door, already dressed in his charcoal suit. "Mom?" he called out, his voice catching slightly with emotion. "Can I come in?" "Of course, sweetheart," Maria answered, turning to see her son's reaction. Tommy stood in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in his mother's appearance. Her cream-colored dress was elegant yet simple, with delicate lace details that caught the morning light. "Mom, you look beautiful," he whispered. Downstairs, guests filtered into the mansion's garden, where rows of white chairs faced an arch woven with roses and ivy. James stood near the entrance, greeting arrivals with warm handshakes and genuine smiles, his excitement barely contained beneath his composed exterior. In the bridal suite, Tommy practiced his steps, counting under his breath as he had during rehearsal. "I want to do this perfectly," he insisted, straightening his boutonniere for the 10th time. "Honey," Maria said softly, taking his hands in hers, "just having you walk me down the aisle is perfect enough." The wedding coordinator appeared at the door, signaling it was time. Tommy offered his arm to his mother, standing tall despite his nervousness. They made their way to the garden entrance, where the rest of the wedding party waited. As the music began, guests turned in their seats, a collective murmur of appreciation rippling through the crowd. Tommy and Maria appeared at the end of the flower-lined aisle, and James's breath caught in his throat. Maria moved forward on Tommy's arm, her steps measured and graceful. Tommy matched her pace perfectly, his chest swelling with pride as he guided his mother toward James. Tears glistened in James's eyes as he watched them approach, overwhelmed by the sight of his bride and the young man who would soon be his son. When they reached the altar, Tommy turned to his mother, carefully lifting her veil to kiss her cheek. He then took James's hand and placed it in his mother's, a gesture that spoke volumes about his acceptance and trust. James and Maria faced each other, their hands clasped tightly as they began their vows. James's voice was steady, but full of emotion as he spoke of finding love again when he least expected it, of the healing power of their connection, and of his commitment to both Maria and Tommy. Maria's vows reflected their shared journey through grief and recovery, speaking of second chances and the beauty of building a new family from the foundations of the past. She acknowledged the strength they found in each other and promised to continue growing together in love and understanding. As they exchanged rings, Tommy stood nearby, beaming with joy. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and James leaned in to kiss his bride. The garden erupted in applause and cheers, the sound echoing off the mansion's walls as their families celebrated the union of not just two people, but the blending of two families into one. The late summer breeze rustled through the trees as Maria and James pulled into the driveway of the mansion after their 2-week honeymoon in Italy. The grand house loomed before them, its familiar shadows now feeling more like echoes of the past than promises for the future. "It's time," James said softly, squeezing Maria's hand. They had discussed it thoroughly during their honeymoon, the need for a fresh start in a place unmarked by old memories. Over the next few weeks, they worked with a real estate agent to list the mansion while simultaneously searching for their new home. During one particularly promising house viewing, they found themselves standing in a sun-filled living room of a charming colonial-style house with a wraparound porch. "This feels different," Maria observed, running her hand along the smooth wooden banister of the staircase. The house was smaller than the mansion, but still spacious enough for their family, with 4 bedrooms and a cozy study that James immediately loved. James nodded, watching how the sunlight played across the hardwood floors. "It feels like us," he said simply. They made an offer that day, and within weeks, they were arranging furniture in their new home. Maria carefully unpacked boxes in the kitchen, while James organized his books in the study. They worked together to choose new paint colors, settling on warm earth tones that made the spaces feel intimate and welcoming. "What do you think about this for the living room?" Maria asked, holding up a thick, soft throw blanket in shades of blue and green. James smiled, remembering how she'd always wrapped herself in blankets while reading in the mansion's library. "Perfect," he replied, helping her drape it over their new sofa. They had chosen furniture that blended both their tastes, James's appreciation for classic pieces and Maria's love of comfortable, practical items. In the dining room, they hung a mixture of family photos, old and new, creating a gallery wall that told their story. Pictures from their wedding stood alongside vintage family portraits and casual snapshots of Tommy's childhood. When Sarah arrived with her family for their first visit, she stood in the entryway, taking in the transformed space. "This is absolutely lovely," she exclaimed, her children already racing up the stairs to explore. The kitchen filled with the aroma of coffee and freshly baked cookies as they gathered around the new dining table. The sounds of children's laughter drifted down from upstairs, mixing with the adults' conversation below. James watched as Maria served coffee in their new mugs, while Sarah's husband helped Tommy set up a board game on the coffee table. "This feels right," James whispered to Maria as she passed him a cookie. She smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. Their new home wasn't grand or imposing like the mansion, but it was warm, welcoming, and most importantly, it was theirs. A perfect space for their blended family to grow and create new memories together. The autumn morning buzzed with activity as Maria and James transformed the local community center's grounds into a vibrant fair space. Colorful banners announcing "Hope and Help," supporting single-parent families fluttered in the breeze, while volunteers set up booths and activity stations. "The face painting station goes here," Maria directed, pointing to a shaded spot near the entrance. Her experience as a single mother had inspired their charity's mission, and she'd poured her heart into organizing this inaugural event. James worked alongside local business owners, helping them arrange their donated items for the silent auction. "These gift baskets will definitely draw attention," he said, adjusting a particularly elaborate arrangement from the local spa. Throughout the morning, more volunteers arrived, many of them single mothers themselves who had heard about the initiative through local support groups. Maria greeted each one warmly, making sure they felt valued and appreciated. "I was where you are now," she told a young mother who arrived with her toddler. "That's why this matters so much to me." The woman's eyes welled up with tears as Maria gave her a gentle hug. As the fair opened to the public, families began streaming in. Children rushed to the game stations while parents browsed information booths about local resources and support services. The aroma of popcorn and cotton candy filled the air, creating a festive atmosphere that put everyone at ease. Maria took the stage mid-afternoon to share her story. Her voice carried across the crowd, steady and sincere, as she described her own journey as a single mother. "We're not just here to raise funds," she explained. "We're here to build a community where no parent feels alone in their struggle." James watched from the side, proud of how naturally Maria connected with everyone. She moved through the crowd afterward, listening to stories, offering encouragement, and connecting people with resources they needed. Local businesses reported strong sales, with all proceeds going to the charity. The silent auction tables buzzed with activity as community members bid on items, from restaurant gift certificates to weekend getaway packages. "This is exactly what our community needed," said the local grocery store owner, watching children play games while their parents networked and shared experiences. "You've created something special here." By late afternoon, the fair was in full swing. The volunteer coordinator reported that several attendees had already signed up to help with future events. Support group sign-up sheets filled quickly, and local service providers collected contact information from families interested in their programs. Maria and James moved through the crowd together, thanking volunteers and chatting with participants. They stopped to watch a group of children playing together while their mothers exchanged phone numbers nearby. "Look at that," Maria whispered to James, gesturing to the spontaneous connections forming all around them. "This is what we hoped for." The fair's success exceeded their expectations, not just in funds raised, but in the genuine community engagement it fostered. As the event wound down, Maria and James stood together, watching volunteers and participants exchanging hugs and contact information, making plans to meet again. The soft glow of table lamps filled Maria and James's living room as they settled onto their comfortable sofa. A leather-bound photo album rested between them, its pages holding memories of their remarkable journey together. "Remember this?" James asked, pointing to the faded summer camp photograph that had changed everything. The image showed two children, unknowingly bound by fate, smiling at the camera during a warm summer day decades ago. Maria traced the edge of the photograph with gentle fingers. "It's amazing how one picture brought everything full circle," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "Who would have thought we'd end up here?" They continued turning pages, each photograph telling a story of their shared past and present. There were pictures from their wedding, their first charity event, and countless moments with their blended family. James closed the album and turned to Maria. "I've been thinking about the charity," he said, reaching for a notebook on the coffee table. "There's so much more we could do." Maria's eyes lit up as she leaned forward. "What did you have in mind?" "We could expand the support groups," James suggested, jotting down notes. "Maybe add counseling services, job training programs. The last fair showed us how many families need help." "And mentorship programs," Maria added eagerly, "connecting experienced single parents with those just starting out. I remember how lost I felt in the beginning." They spent the next hour brainstorming ideas, their enthusiasm growing with each possibility. James outlined plans for partnering with local businesses to create job opportunities, while Maria described workshops on financial planning and self-care. "We could use the community center more regularly," Maria suggested, making notes of her own. "Create a consistent schedule of programs throughout the year." James nodded, already calculating the resources they'd need. "The last fundraiser exceeded our expectations. We could allocate those funds to start some of these programs." The sound of cars pulling into their driveway interrupted their planning. Through the window, they could see their family members arriving for their weekly gathering. Sarah, James's half-sister, was the first to step out, carrying a covered dish. Maria's son followed, helping James's nieces unload more food and supplies. They moved to the garden, where strings of lights twinkled in the growing dusk. The evening air was perfect, cool and fragrant with blooming flowers. Their loved ones gathered around the outdoor table, sharing stories and laughter as plates were passed around. The garden, once just a dream during their planning sessions, had become a cherished gathering space. Raised beds filled with vegetables lined one side, while flowering plants added splashes of color throughout. It was a living symbol of their shared vision, growing more beautiful with each passing season. Maria and James sat side by side, taking in the scene before them. Sarah was showing Maria's son pictures on her phone, both laughing at something on the screen. The children chased each other around the garden paths, their giggles carrying on the evening breeze. The warmth of family, the success of their charity work, and the peace they'd found together. It was everything they'd hoped for and more. As James squeezed Maria's hand, they shared a look of contentment, grateful for the twisted path that had led them to this moment. If you enjoyed the story of Maria and James, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.